pray.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, the Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere and fillest all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us, and cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one.
So continuing where we left off, last week we were talking about the presence of the serpent and the presence of Satan as a source of temptation in multiple parallels throughout the scriptural witness. So we saw that, obviously we started with that, with understanding this relationship between the serpent in the garden and Satan in the desert with Christ's temptation. And we extended that to look at how Satan functions in the story of Job. And that is another layer and another perplexing layer where, and I suppose I should have been more specific about this. So I raised these interesting questions. What is the serpent doing in the garden? What is the Satan doing in the desert with Christ? Why is Satan, which means the accuser, why is he walking amongst the sons of God in the council of the kingdom and the council of God? Why does he seem to be almost like a member of the council? And we should state that, it's not like in Job, Satan is not a fallen figure. We need to be very clear about that. Yes, the Bible teaches that there is a devil, and that devil is very dangerous to us. That devil is very insidious, if you will. So we have to be careful when we read Job and we start asking questions like, why does God allow this? And Satan is talking to God and saying, let's test Job. A lot of this is simply a way of revealing these patterns, and it's those patterns that we're looking at, right? Job is only faithful to you because you've given him all this wonderful things. Take it away, and he'll start to deny you. And that's the testing of Job. But the other thing to really point out in Job is that notice that Satan has no real power. Satan has no power to simply say, I'm going after Job on my own. He has to get permission. And the mystery of that permission is one thing, but another thing, and something very fundamental for us, is that Satan is not simply an independent evil agent that can do whatever he wants. That creation is under the providential protection of a loving Father. And that loving Father does not allow things to happen simply for arbitrary purposes. And that's really gets to the heart of the mystery of Job's questioning of God and God's questioning of Job at the end. We can't penetrate the mystery of God's purposes, so what looks arbitrary to us, what looks senseless and meaningless to us, actually has great meaning and great power on another level. We just can't see it because we're limited in our createdness. So there's this whole dimension going on there, and it forms the backdrop for us to just go ahead then and to dive right in to Genesis, which we began to read last week. And I just want to point out some of these things that we've been talking about and how the pattern is what we need to be aware of in our own lives. So we know, of course, the story of Adam and Eve. We know that they've been given all the vegetables and fruits and seeds of the earth to eat, so that they are original vegans, if you will. They do not eat animals. We talked about this last fall, maybe, this mystery that what does it mean that Adam and Eve the human person is given dominion over the rest of creation, including all the animals, but we don't eat the animals. That's very, very important for us to kind of consider that this is temple language, it's paradise language. It's about loving stewardship. It's about raising up creation to the level of the glory of God, to participate in the glory of God. And the human person has that primary function within creation, to unite in themselves, created and uncreated, et cetera, et cetera. We've talked, I don't want to go back through all that right now, but to be this sort of locus, the center of unification for the things on earth and the things of God, the things of heaven. We meet as priests and we offer them up, and then they are elevated. And so our dominion is not a question of domination or use it however you want. It's really a question of asking, how have all things been made to serve to the glory of God? That's really the question. And Satan is going to push that really hard, okay? And this is going to be one of the great sources of our temptation and raise all kinds of painful questions for us today, as it has in all generations. But so there they are. Adam and Eve are in the garden. The garden, remember, is paradise. It's not just a place where you stand around and eat. It's a place of dynamic action, of the worship of God. It's where man meets God, and we see that in the story where after Satan's work begins, God is walking in the garden and Adam and Eve hide from him. We'll get to that in a moment. And that the human person is given a purpose, right? So this purpose is really important to keep in mind. And so we read this last week. The serpent was more subtle than any wild creature. He said to the woman, "Did God say you shall not eat of any tree of the garden?" So notice that Satan immediately starts with a question, and he's sowing seeds of doubt. Did God really say you shall not eat of any tree of the garden? And of course, that's not what God said. And the woman says to the serpent, "We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it lest you die." Some commentators, so obviously they're talking about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which they've been commanded not to eat. Some commentators would say that when Eve adds this extra detail, "don't even touch it," that she's sort of already confusing in her own mind the meaning of that tree. I question that a little bit, because I think that if we read this as a temple document, if we read this as referring to what it means to stand in the presence of God, what we find in the law later on is all kinds of restrictions about what cannot be touched, including the fact that while the temple is a house of prayer for all the peoples of the earth, not all the peoples of the earth have equal access into the temple. That's a very important thing. And in fact, there are boundaries, and those boundaries are not to be transgressed. And in fact, there are parts of the temple which cannot even be touched by Gentiles, cannot even be touched by those who are not supposed to be there, lest the whole temple be defiled, and they have to go through a whole ritual process of reconnecting. So it may simply be that this is a sort of a temple document. This would make sense. Yes, if something's forbidden by God, if there's a boundary connected to it, then you don't participate, you don't eat of it, you don't even touch it, you don't go near it, all right? So that's actually quite consistent with understanding this Genesis text as really a temple context document. But the serpent says to the woman, "You will not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." So he lies, right? So he lies, okay? That's very important. And he's taking God's words and he's twisting them. And something very, very interesting happens now here in this exchange. "So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons." Now here's an important detail about this story. What does the serpent promise? If you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. That's what he says to them. If you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. Well, that sounds pretty good, right? I want my eyes open. And notice that they eat of it, and then it says, then the eyes of both were opened, right? So that happens. This little promise that he makes, if you eat of it, your eyes will be open. Then the eyes of both of them were open. It clearly happens, but they don't see what they expected to see. They don't see what they expected to see. And that's where that lie comes in. You shall not die. God knows that if you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So there's a part of it that's true, and a part of it that's false. And that's always the difficulty with temptation. That's always the difficulty with desire. There's a part of any temptation or desire that is true, and then there's a part of it that's a lie. And the lie is the bigger part of it. That's the key. The truth is, God has no desire to keep us ignorant. God has no desire to keep our eyes shut so that we're just obedient little, robots that don't know what's good for them and just obey the rules. That's not what God's plan is. Remember that the whole commandment to keep and till the garden, or to go forth and prosper and subdue the earth, again, remember, having dominion over the animals but not eating the animals, etc. All of that is a way of God saying, I want you to participate with me in the unfolding of paradise into all of creation. I want you to play a role. I want you to have a part. I want you to share in the goodness of all that is, so that you as the priest of creation raise it up, and then you yourself are raised up to my presence. God wants good gifts, so that the eyes of the man and the woman are supposed to be opened, but only when they can see the truth and be free from the shackles of death. And so Satan's whole strategy here is to both create desire within a statement of a lie. And this is really key too then. So not only does this come true, their eyes are open, and what they see they didn't understand, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But notice that after Satan talks to the woman and says, if you eat of this, your eyes will be open, you'll be like God, Again, the fathers are very clear. This is really important. Adam and Eve are supposed to be like God. That's what it means to be created in his image and likeness. Of course they'll be like God. They are like God already, you see. But what Satan is offering them is something that is a transgression of boundaries, the boundary between the created and the uncreated. We're to unite the created and the uncreated. We are not to violate the boundary of the uncreated, right? So he takes a promise. He takes a potentiality. Yes, we are called to be like God, but then he subverts it into take from God what is yours. That's the danger. Take from God what belongs to you. Seize your own control. Seize your own destiny. Be your own person. And the key here is that when Eve hears that, notice what happens. So she looks and she sees, oh, that tree is good for food. I hadn't noticed that. There's fruit on that, and it looks like it's appealing to me. She sees that the tree is good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes. Her mind is already being opened to transgress this boundary, whereas before she didn't think of it. Before she had everything. She and Adam had everything in the garden that they could possibly need or want. God provided all within the context of this loving communion. But now that some other voice has come in and has offered alternative versions of this, she's starting to look and she's starting to change the way she perceives things. She sees that the tree was to be desired to make one wise. It was a delight to the eyes, and it's desired to make one wise. And so what has Satan done? Satan has created a passion within her. Satan has created a movement which is not according to the commandment of God. And that's in essence what all the passions are. We're going to talk about the passions in relationship to the mystery of the garments of skin as we go through Great Lent, which is a wonderful topic to do during Great Lent, because that's what we're all struggling with and confessing and repenting of. but we can see in the garden what it actually entails. It's a movement towards something around which there's a boundary and that we are not to transgress, not because God is an arbitrary tyrant, but because by doing so, we become harmed. So like any parent tells their child, don't watch a superhero show and then fly headfirst off the stairs, right? That's not because they're evil tyrants. It's because they don't want their children to be hurt. And children need those boundaries. Children are constantly having to be reminded. Madishka did this once at her parents' house right over there in Ingomar. She was on a wall. She was probably maybe 4 years old. She was standing on a stone wall, and she'd been watching, cartoons or superhero stories, and she just decided, I'm feeling it, and she just leapt right off and splat right on the concrete, She can tell you about that later. Kids do this stuff all the time. Adults do this all the time. Just look at YouTube. So it's creating a desire that is harmful. It's creating a desire that will tear you down. And that's fundamentally what Satan does. He tries to get us to want something that we didn't know we wanted. That's really what he's trying to do, right? So that's this whole dilemma or this whole unfolding of Eve, like, okay, now I'm looking at it. Oh, the food does look good. Oh, it's not even doesn't look just as it look good, but it's a delight even to look at. And now I can't stop thinking about it. And now I'm obsessing about this tree. I must have this tree. And it's, hey, after all, isn't it going to make me wise? Is it going to make me know the difference between good and evil? If I'm created in the image of God, don't you think God really wants me to do this? So, and there she goes. Yes. Right. Yeah, so that's a great question for our audience at home. What's the point of having something that's available to them, but which they're told not to eat? Isn't that a little bit of a setup? Doesn't it seem a little bit like a manipulation? So I think context is everything here, and that's why I've been pushing all along as we've been talking about creation theology all through the fall, and now the fall itself, the fall in the spring, in the late winter spring. The context of this is the temple, and the context of this is the difference between what it means to be created and uncreated, what it means to be holy and defiled. And there's this whole system, this whole language and behavior pattern around the temple, which is really this fundamental question: how does the human person approach the holy God who is a consuming fire and not get destroyed? That's the fundamental question of all of these texts. That's the context. That's why paradise has to be understood correctly. It's not just a garden with food where you just stand around and you're bored all day because you just eat. What do you want to do? I don't know. Eat. And that's like we have no other picture of the garden in Genesis because we have these words that mean that to us. That's what a garden is. It's beautiful, it's nice, but what do you do there? Aren't you bored all the time? No, it's not boring because it's filled with the presence of God. But there are boundaries to the presence of God. But the purpose of those boundaries and the purpose of the boundary of this tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not to manipulate, it's not to set them up, it's not to create an unfair advantage or anything like that. The purpose of boundaries in the language of the temple is precisely to unite. So what the fathers are really adamant about regarding the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is that the admonition, do not eat of it, is not an absolute, like, forever don't eat of it. But they take this as this element that Adam and Eve are, and there's no better word to use than immature. We don't mean immature as in bouncing off the walls and doing weird things. We just mean that they are to grow. They are young and they are to grow older. And that young and old image for us is to gain knowledge in a way that they can receive it and maintain their communion with God in the tree of life. So the purpose of the admonition, don't eat the tree, is not a permanent thing according to the teaching of the fathers. It's a temporary thing. They are to grow so that they can participate in the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but not lose their communion with God in the process. So, like anything, if we understand this, we have these even in our temple, and this is where last year we talked a lot about these boundaries within our own temple. You know, if you're an altar server, we bring you back there, we put a nice robe on you, we give you a blessing, and we say, now don't touch the altar. Right? Or maybe that's not even common knowledge, but altar servers are not permitted to touch the altar. To touch the altar, you must be a deacon or a priest or a bishop, or to have received a special blessing. Sometimes our sub-deacons, for instance, have to touch the altar depending on where the bishop's paraphernalia goes, his holy things go during a service. But there's a boundary there. And what is the boundary? The boundary is this is holy, and you have to respect what is holy. And you have to be consecrated to enter into contact with the holy. This is essential for understanding the biblical mind. If we read the Bible without grasping this fundamental sort of temple context, we really get so much wrong about what's happening in it. And this is one of them, because we can see it in other situations. There are other examples, just like there are other examples of Satan creating desire and trying to create temptation in others. There are examples of God saying, don't eat and don't touch. And we have, the two that touch the Ark of the Covenant, presumably because it's falling, and they're like, oh no, we don't want it to fall, but they were specifically told not to touch it, and they're consumed by fire, And we see this over and over again. When Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, he's allowed to go all the way up into the mount. The priests are allowed to go halfway. The people aren't even allowed to touch the mountain, right? So the mountain's there, but the mountain has become the locus of the presence of God. And so now again we have this question of holiness. How do you touch the fire and not get burned? The commandment is not, again, arbitrary, and it's not setting us up. It's protective. And if our perception is working correctly, we will receive it as protective. And indeed, when people touch the mountain, when they were told not to touch the mountain in the Bible, they die, or there's the threat that they would die. So we see this pattern. It's not just in the garden. We see this pattern throughout the Old Testament, and I would argue we even see it even today when we think about who touches the holy things and how do we touch, how do we come into contact with that which is holy. This whole spectrum of clean and unclean in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses, is the same fundamental question. How do we who are fallen become purified so that we might participate in the glory of God without the glory of God, which is light and fire, destroying us because we are created and he is uncreated, and there is danger. Our God is a consuming fire. So that's really the answer to that, is that it might appear somewhat like a setup to us, but it really, within its context, it makes perfect sense. And within its context, if we understand things are holy, I should not touch them, I should not partake of them, if I am not in the process of at least being purified, I shouldn't go close to the things of God. That's the whole biblical worldview. Mm-hmm. That's a big question. Sort of like yes and no and no. We do receive a consequence of the choice of our ancestors. And again, this is something that ancient people would have seen as, oh, of course we do. Of course we do. Are you born with the inherited gene expression of your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents? Yes, you are. Are we like, oh, well, that's terrible. I should be my own person. I should have my own genetic makeup. I should be completely isolated and independent from all other people, and nothing that they've ever done should be passed on to me. But you know what? And this is a fascinating question. We know now that certain behaviors can change our gene expression in our own bodies, and that those changed gene expressions can be passed on to our children through childbirth. So not only do we receive in this passive sense whatever genes our parents had from their parents, etc., all the way back to the beginning of time, to the beginning of the first parents, but our actions affect who and how we are, and we pass that on to our children, whether we like it or not. So this idea that is going on in Genesis about the fall, and one of the books that I've mentioned a few times to you all, the Religion of the Apostles, by Father, I'm blanking on his name. I'll think of it in a moment. But part of that book, which is really wonderful, is he describes, as we're talking about these different scenarios with Satan throughout the scriptures, he talks about not the fall, but the falls. And there are multiple falls. Another example, for instance, of a fall in the Old Testament is the Tower of Babel. And this is another example where a boundary has been set, and people are trying to transgress that boundary, and that transgression of that boundary leads to catastrophe and consequence, the division of people into the language, or into different languages and different tribes and ethnicities, so they can't understand each other. And it's the same idea. Our actions change and affect us, and how our actions change and affect us can be passed on to our children. And so what happens with Adam and Eve, of course, is that by making this choice under the temptation of the devil, and this is where, John, this question is complicated, our tradition as Orthodox Christians would say, yes, Adam and Eve were immature in this sense, especially we find this in the teachings of Irenaeus, especially. Yes, they were immature, and that means that the fall in Orthodox thinking is not the kind of you're born into guilt and God's wrath must go against you, and this whole idea in the Western tradition, for instance, that God's wrath has to be executed even on unbaptized infants because they've been born with the guilt and really the stain of evil of Adam and Eve from all the way back, and it's this horrible thing. God, instead of being this wrathful, vengeful person, he keeps setting up boundaries so that those boundaries can unite us back into his presence. And ultimately, it will be, of course, Jesus Christ who does that. And this is the whole movement and pattern of redemption. Creative fall redemption, atonement, is this movement back into the relationship with God. God is the one who initiates it. God is the one who makes it possible. He's not the one who says, you fell and you're terrible and I'm angry and my wrath must be appeased and avenged and I've got to kill somebody, and that's where you get into Anselm, not our tradition, and this idea of a substitutionary atonement. God just has to kill somebody for this, and so he'll kill his own son instead of killing us. And hooray, we're saved, we're alive because Jesus died and his Father killed him. That is not the gospel. That is not the gospel. That is not what the sacred scriptures teach. God forbid. God is a loving God all the way through. But there are boundaries. And again, the purpose of the boundaries is not to separate us or put us in our place. The boundaries are there so that we can grow further into being his image. The boundaries are in place so that we can grow further into his likeness. So all those boundaries, the boundary of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is there precisely so that we have this path forward and upwards into the presence of God. And so that's why in Orthodox thinking and temple thinking, the tree of life, really is in the Holy of Holies. But also for us, the tree of life is always the cross. And the cross stands at the mystery of the Holy of Holies as being the way that God is. The cross is the way that God is. Complete self-emptying love. Holding on to nothing so that all might be drawn into the kingdom. That is how God is. And that's what he's calling us to be. That's why we need to take our time to develop our eyes, to open correctly, to see the truth about this, but to not lose it. And you see, the losing it is there's death there. And we don't know what to do with that. And that's what we get from Adam and Eve. That's what they put into the inherited state of being that we receive. This state of mortality, this state of the fear of mortality, and this instinct to hold on to the life that we can't hold on to, and therefore all we can do is have varying ways of managing death, managing shame, managing embarrassment. And so this is, we really should save this because we have to finish here in just a moment, but let me just say that the first thing that happens, the eyes of both were open, they knew that they were naked. Boy, that's a loaded statement right there, and we need to talk about it because there's ways like the knowledge of their nakedness, which you might, oh, this is a little embarrassing, should we be talking about that in church? Well, I mean, it's right at the center of the story, and it means so many things. That's the thing about it. It doesn't mean that they were naked and they didn't know it, and then they knew they were naked, and so that's the point of the story. That's not what it means. It actually means that they were bereft of grace. They were bereft of the garment of light in which they were clothed by God's grace. And that's why that becomes the same garment of light that is placed on you when you emerge naked from the baptismal font. There's a parallelism there. You see, you lose the garment. Oh no, I don't have it. But what is it really? It's not really about physical nakedness the way we think of it. It's really about I'm no longer clothed with the light of God. And so what's the first thing that they do? They begin to use the elements of the garden, not to the glory of God, but to cover their shame. The first use of technology in Genesis is to cover the shame and to manage their mortality. They knew that they were naked. They sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons, right? So now it's not just that they got some leaves and, somehow just wrapped them around. They made something, right? They made something. That's important. It might seem like one of those details that we go right past. Oh, whatever, sure, they made something. No, they used their God-given ability to relate to their environment, to manipulate that environment, and to cover their mortality, to cover their shame. That's what's going on with the fig leaves, and that's part of the mystery of God saying, no, not fig leaves, but garments of skin. So let's save that for next time. We'll break here, just as it's a good spot to do so. Obviously, I'm not here next week. There's no church school for kids or adults next week while we travel. So in 2 weeks, which will be, the start of Great, Forgiveness Sunday, we'll pick this up and continue.